Hi everybody, welcome to our webinar today. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes to for people to join, and then we'll get going. So if you don't mind holding on for a couple of minutes, thank you. Hi everybody who's just joined. We're just waiting for a couple of minutes to for everyone else to join, and then we'll get going. So you can bear with us. Thanks. Okay, I think we'll get going. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining today. ClimateCare's webinar on the role of offsetting in the journey to net zero. My name is Robert Stevens. I am Director of Partnerships at ClimateCare, and I'm joined today by my colleague Oliver Forster, who is our Head of Business Development. Before we dive in, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, everybody in the audience will be placed on mute throughout the duration of the webinar. And we are going to have a presentation from Ollie of about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have 20-25 minutes for questions. So the whole session should last about 40 to 45 minutes. And please, to ask questions, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of the Zoom call. We'll collect questions over the course of the webinar, and then we'll start with the Q&A after the presentation. And please do keep bringing those questions in, and we will try to get round to answering them all. Lastly, before we start, just to explain that we are recording the webinar, and it will be made available to everyone who has joined today and subscribed to watch again at a later date at their leisure. So without further ado, I see a few familiar names dialed in today, but for those of you who don't know ClimateCare, we're a profit-for-purpose business, B Corporation certified, that's focused on tackling climate change and delivering sustainable development. Since 1997, we've worked with companies, governments, and individuals to reduce their environmental impact. And one of our key activities is financing, managing, and developing high-quality projects around the world which reduce emissions. We currently work with over 300 projects, and to date we're very proud to have reduced almost 50 million tons of CO2 alongside our partners. Carbon offsetting is an important tool in the carbon reduction strategy of most of our corporate clients, and they're taking responsibility now for their unavoidable footprint whilst they reduce their emissions at source over time. And more of our clients are committing to science-based targets and setting themselves deadlines to reach the destination of net zero. And today's webinar is really to share our experience to date of this transition onto a net zero journey. And I'm delighted to hand over to Ollie in a moment to answer some of the questions we're encountering more and more frequently. And these include, what is net zero? What does it mean? How do we get there? And what role does offsetting emissions play on that journey? So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ollie, who will run you through the presentation.
Thanks very much, Rob. So this presentation will be 15 to 20 minutes on the role of offsetting in the journey to net zero. And I think whilst it will be short, we'll cover a fair amount of ground. So I think the key take-home messages from this presentation are encourage you as organizations to think about how to measure and reduce your emissions in line with science-based reduction trajectory, but also to complement that net zero journey with compensating for your emissions today through high quality offsets, and also on thinking now about your strategy and using offsets to secure your net zero position in the future. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. So the first thing we wanted to start off with was the definition of net zero. And there have been a few definitions in circulation, but I think consensus is really emerging now around this definition on your screen, which is published by the Science Based Targets Initiative. And what the definition says, and I'll read it out, is that net zero means achieving a state in which the activities within the value chain of a company result in no net impact on the climate from greenhouse gas emissions. This is achieved by reducing value chain greenhouse gas emissions and by balancing the impact of any remaining greenhouse gas emissions with an appropriate amount of carbon removals. So 2 bits to the definition, and I think they set the scene really well for corporate net zero. And the first bit introduces this concept of no net impact, of balancing what you're putting into the system, greenhouse gas emissions, with what you're taking out. And the second clause talks about how you do that. So the first bit means reducing your value chain emissions as far and as fast as possible. And the second bit talks about balancing any very hard to reduce remaining greenhouse gas emissions with removals. So I think just that definition alone really sets the scene for a corporate trajectory to net zero. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. So hopefully I won't need to persuade most of the people on this call about the need for action, but what we all know is that at the moment we're on a trajectory for about 3.5 degrees of warming by 2100, and that will result in pretty disastrous climate breakdown. So we know that in order to limit climate change and to limit it to 2 degrees of warming, or 1.5 degrees of warming even, we need to achieve net zero by mid-century at the latest. And what that entails is halving global emissions by 2030. And just to illustrate that challenge, that means reducing the annual emissions equivalent of China, India, the European Union, and America to half global emissions by 2030. So, to be frank, that is a climate moonshot, and it requires all actors in societies, from government to companies to individuals, to act as far and as fast as possible. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. Good news is that pledges around net zero are really increasing rapidly, and countries are pledging net zero, cities are taking action at the city level, and companies are also acting. And I think those pledges are increasing so quickly now that this slide's already out of date. I think Science Based Targets Initiative went past their 1,000th company subscribing to a science-based target quite recently. So pledge for action is really increasing, but what we've got to do now is convert those pledges into action. And if you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. The actions involved in moving towards net zero are fourfold, and you can see them on the screen here. So the first thing to do is to measure and disclose your carbon emissions. And I think what's really changed recently is the onus being on measuring a much broader scope of your carbon emissions. So beyond your direct impact, what is happening now is that companies are measuring their entire scope 3 emissions, so getting a much more holistic view of carbon emissions across their activities and sphere of influence. Second thing you've got to do is reduce your climate impact, and of course the onus is on reducing your climate impact in line with what the science demands for us to meet a 1.5 or 2 degree world. So it's no good just reducing, you've got to reduce radically in line with what science demands. The third area is to finance emissions reductions and activities to tackle climate change beyond your value chain. And the fourth area, not to be underestimated, is to advocate for climate policy, because I think within certainly the voluntary carbon market and voluntary action, a big benefit of that is signaling to governments and wider society that you are stepping up and delivering change, and that calls the rest of the actors in society to follow your lead and increase ambition. Go on to the next slide, please, Matt. So specifically within that third bucket about sponsoring emission reductions beyond your value chain, that's really where carbon offsetting fits in as one of the principal mechanisms of doing that. And the definition for carbon offsetting, technically speaking, is the practice of compensating for greenhouse gas emissions by retiring carbon credits generated through carbon reduction projects. A key aspect to that is that carbon offsetting can be done through either avoidance or removal projects. So when we talk about avoidance projects, we're talking about projects which stop more greenhouse gas emissions from entering into the atmosphere. When we talk about removal projects, we're talking about projects which suck carbon dioxide that's already out of the atmosphere and sequester it in carbon sinks. I like this definition, but I think it's fairly technical. The best way that I like to think about carbon offsetting is that it's a payment for an outcome. And in that way, it's very similar to lots of the other things we pay for in society. And when you buy a car, you're paying for the outcome, which is that car. And in the same way, when you buy a carbon credit, so long as it's a high quality carbon credit, you're paying for the process of someone reducing or removing 1 ton of carbon from the atmosphere. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. What we've really seen recently is this really broad acceptance of offsetting being a vital part of meeting the demands of net zero. And I can't emphasize enough how the discussion that we've been part of at ClimateCare has really moved from whether an entity should offset or not to how an entity should offset. And that discussion is really being driven now by thought leaders, including WWF, Science Based Targets Initiative, Mark Carney's Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. And of course, that's pleasing for us to see because we've been advocating offsetting for a long time. But I think it's really reflective of this just consensus now that offsetting is going to be a key part of meeting the demands of net zero, and particularly this decade. As I said, we've got to really drastically reduce emissions this decade to half emissions by 2030. Offsetting will play 2 roles in that. One is delivering emission reductions in hard to abate sectors, and the other is mobilizing capital for carbon reduction projects. And I think particularly projects which don't typically fall within the value chain of lots of companies, such as projects which protect rainforests, for example. Those kind of projects don't typically receive finance, but are obviously key. It's key that we protect rainforest if we're going to achieve our global carbon targets overall. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. So I think this slide here is really the crux of the webinar, because what this sets out is how carbon credits can support companies, how carbon offsetting can support companies on their decarbonisation pathway to net zero. So what the diagram shows are tons on the y-axis, tons of carbon emissions, and then on the x-axis is the journey through time. And in the red, you can see company emissions, and you can see that those reduce as we go forward in time. And again, the onus must be on reducing your emissions in line with what the science demands in order to meet our global climate targets. And then under the dividing line in the blue, you can see the carbon offset activity that the company could undertake. And some key features of this is first that science-based targets and others are recognizing that what you should do is to balance your carbon footprint, to compensate and take responsibility for that carbon footprint on the journey to net zero by using carbon credits to balance that footprint as you go on the journey. The second key feature to note is that over time, your carbon offset activity needs to transition from being focused on avoidance projects to being focused on removal projects. And the reason for that is at the point of net zero, you remember in the net zero definition, you need to be balancing any residual emissions, any impossible or hard to abate emissions with removal credits specifically. And so what that means on a practical level is transitioning your portfolio from activities like protecting rainforests, which stops more carbon from going into the atmosphere, to activities such as planting new trees or using technology to take carbon out of the atmosphere. What it means for corporates is that at the moment, the onus is not just on securing credits to meet your carbon footprint in any given year, but also planning for that journey to net zero and planning your offset strategy, working with organizations to do that. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. In these next slides, we've just got some quotes from experts that recommend offsetting, and I think this really supports what I was saying earlier about there being this really broad coalition of actors now acknowledging the key role that offsetting has to play if we're going to reach net zero, and particularly in this decade. So Cristiana Figueres, if you go on to the next couple of slides, there's also a quote from Alberto Pineda, who's the co-founder of the Science Based Target Initiative, and Jonathan Porritt, who's the co-founder of Forum for the Future. If you go on to the next slide, Matt. So what, in this kind of final section, we just wanted to tell you a little bit more about ClimateCare and some of the work that we're doing. So as ClimateCare, I mean, we work with lots of large organizations, including Jaguar Land Rover, Co-op, Aviva, on their carbon offset programs, and have done since our foundation. But what we are is vertically integrated. So not only do we work with those big organizations, but we also work to actually develop the projects on the ground which deliver the emissions reductions. I'm very proud to say that we're ranked the best project developer in the voluntary carbon market overall this year. The other thing that we're widely recognized for is operating at the quality end of the voluntary carbon market. And as Rob mentioned in his introduction, we're currently the highest scoring B Corporation in the UK, which is something that I think we're all really proud about. It means that of a group of companies that are well recognized for their social and environmental positive impact, ClimateCare really stands out. We are based in the UK and Nairobi, and we're also one of the founding members of CROA, which is the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, which strives to deliver and develop best practice in the voluntary carbon market and how that operates. If you go on to the next slide, Matt. What we're really recognized for is our Climate Plus Care approach, and this is what we consider the really high quality way of doing carbon offset projects. And the Climate Care approach really means working on projects which not only reduce or remove emissions, but also have all of these other sustainable development impacts and improve lives. So a really good example of that is our work in Sierra Leone with the Gola Rainforest Protection Project. The Gola Rainforest is a tranche of pristine rainforest in Sierra Leone, which is home to the last stable population of Western chimpanzees. It's home to pygmy hippos. It's also where David Attenborough shot one of his first programs for the BBC in 1956. And the project that we're working to support helps to protect that rainforest by working with the communities that live around the forest to ensure that that forest is protected, but also livelihoods are improved to create a sustainable solution to protecting that ecosystem. And so that, I think that project really neatly encapsulates what we're talking about when ClimateCare talk about our Climate Plus Care approach to offsetting. If you go on to the next slide, please, Matt. I think this slide just talks again to what I'm saying about carbon offsetting, delivering towards other sustainable development goals. I think it's important that we go beyond considering just climate to delivering projects which also are a sustainable solution overall. They do things like protecting ecosystems, they empower communities, they improve livelihoods. And we go on to the final slide, Matt. So just to run through, we talked about the imperative of reaching net zero by mid-century and really of halving emissions between now and 2030, and how carbon offsetting is going to play a key role in that journey. And that notion is really widely established now by a broad swathe of stakeholders. I think just going back to what I was saying at the start, the key messages for a corporate now looking at your climate strategy is first onus has got to be on measuring and reducing your emissions in line with a science-based pathway, and using offsetting to complement that global journey to net zero, to balance your emissions that you make between now and the point of net zero, and also to think now about your strategy between now and your net zero point, your offset strategy, and how you can take actions today which shore up your net zero point by orienting your portfolio towards projects which remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that is, I promised 15 to 20 minutes. I think that is about 15 minutes. So that's the end of the presentation part of the webinar. And what we wanted to do now was open up to questions.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks for giving the overview. We have we've got a few questions, so I'm trying to see whether we can kind of put them into baskets. Really, the first one is from Mike Reed, and just asking for some clarification on the definition of carbon offsetting. And I think this fits into the area of differentiating between avoidance and removals. So Mike says the definition of carbon offsetting you provide referred to carbon reduction, but did not specify whether that was a reduction in atmospheric carbon or a reduction of carbon emissions. And they are the avoidance and the removal baskets of projects and offsetting approaches. So yeah, if you could speak to the difference between those, Ollie, because this is an important distinction that is becoming clear over time. And also, should corporates think about selecting removals projects only? So already speaking or taking action to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere that's already there, or should they be taking a mixed approach at the moment?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, I would say that definitionally, carbon offsetting can refer to either projects which take carbon out of the atmosphere, which are removals projects, or projects which stop more carbon emissions from entering into the atmosphere, which are referred to as avoidance projects. So I think when you see people talking about carbon offsetting as a broad bucket, they're talking about both of those activities. Now, what has emerged over the last few years as the discussion has become centered on net zero and how offsetting can support in that transition is that this distinction between avoidance and removals projects has really come to the fore in a way that it wasn't previously. So Rob, to get to your second point about whether corporates should just focus on removals now, I would say that, and what ClimateCare is encouraging our partners to look at, is to look at both. And what science-based targets initiatives say on this and how they frame it is that this decade is the decade of climate action for reduction of carbon emissions, so avoidance projects, as well as being a decade for readiness for removals. So that gives a good insight into what an offset strategy can look like. We've got to focus on reducing emissions as fast and as possible, particularly in this decade, as well as scaling up approaches which can remove and sequester emissions in future. I think that the other useful way to frame this is that the reason we shouldn't just transition to removals now is because that risks doing things like there's no point in planting lots of new trees to remove lots of carbon from the atmosphere whilst cutting down our existing standing forests, because then you have to remove the emission which you could have avoided in the first place. So I think that's another useful lens and a useful reason as to why not to just shift all the way to focusing solely on removals now, but to keep a balanced approach certainly in this decade.
Thanks, Ollie. The next couple of questions are around carbon offsetting, climate offsetting as a tool. David has asked, is carbon offsetting a way that some companies don't have to decarbonize? So essentially, is it being used, or is it a tool for slowing down decarbonisation at source with companies. And a similar question from Roxandra is, isn't it more efficient to support companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions instead of buying climate credits? I think that's it's important to sort of contextualize how carbon offsetting fits into this mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the really key emphasis, and I think how the vast majority of companies are using offsetting, is not as an excuse to do to not reduce as fast as they can. I think most companies now really recognize that you've got to reduce your direct emissions as the first priority, and to reduce them as fast as possible, but also to use offsetting to bolster that approach and to support the global transition to net zero, as well as decarbonising your own activities. And the other thing to point out is that I think this idea that companies that offset don't also reduce their own emission is dispelled when you look at the evidence. So there was some research done on carbon disclosure reporting where companies report their carbon emissions, and the finding was that companies that offset their emissions also decarbonize their activities faster. And I think that broadly makes sense to me, is that companies that are aware of the climate challenge sufficiently to make use of the offsetting tool are also the ones that are more likely to think about how they can reduce their own direct carbon emissions. The other way to think about that, which some of our partners are using offsetting, is that it does put a price on carbon on your activities. So if you're offsetting your direct footprint, there is then a cost item on your company's books related to how big your carbon footprint is. So that provides some form of incentive to decrease your carbon emissions, such that that cost line gets smaller over time.
Thanks, Ollie. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so I'm trying to keep on top of them. The next ones are about supporting offset projects and choosing them. So Fiona asks, is it possible to choose offset projects and the mix of them to align with your company objectives? And are there opportunities for employee engagement with projects? And she mentions UK-based projects. Related to that is how important is the location geography of an offset in terms of where it reduces or removes carbon, or is carbon anywhere in the world? So there are two aspects of how we work with our clients to find the right mix.
Yeah, and so on the first point about choosing offset projects, that is how ClimateCare work with our partners, is to choose a portfolio of projects which really aligns with their business. And that might be through the geographical lens, it might be through the technological lens, so what kind of offsets they're supporting, and it might be a mix of both of those factors. And then on the geography and the location of the projects, it's true that a ton of emissions reduced wherever it's reduced in the world is equal, atmospherically speaking. What you do see are different types of projects are better suited to certain locations. So we know that the most valuable terrestrial carbon sink that we have currently in the rainforests, which are in the tropics. So that tells you something about how your carbon offset activity is going to be weighted, because you're likely to want to protect that carbon sink as part of your activity, and therefore the projects are likely to be in countries where you have rainforests. That same paradigm exists with removals activities, where the focus at the moment is largely on tree planting. And of course, trees grow much, much faster where the sun is stronger towards the equator than they do in places like the UK, where they grow relatively slowly. And so if you're looking at it through an emissions lens alone, you'll notice that projects towards the tropics ramp up the amount of carbon that's being sequestered in the trees much more quickly than projects in northern latitudes. Of course, added to that is employee engagement. So what we typically do is we'll design a portfolio that has some aspects that are near your offices, as well as looking at it through a carbon lens alone. So it might be that you support some activity in the UK, if that's where your headquarters are, as well as a global portfolio, so that your staff can visit the projects in the UK, because it's obviously much easier to do that than visiting projects in Sierra Leone, for example. So talk about this mixed portfolio of projects, which kind of balance your climate action.
Thanks, Ollie. We got plenty of questions to get through, Ollie, so don't stop yet.
I'll speed up.
Yeah. Stephen's put a couple of questions. Stephen, I think maybe we should that specifically about your scope 1 and 2 and 3 footprint. I'm thinking maybe we should follow up separately on that, because it's fairly technical, but we'd be very happy to answer. Lawrence has a couple of questions. So how do you actively encourage companies to simply sit on their carbon offsets and use it as an excuse not to take more difficult actions? And related to that from Lawrence as well is, we mentioned, or Ollie, you spoke about the importance of advocating climate policy. How do we as ClimateCare actively lobby against poor quality offsetting, and ensure the quality of what we're doing?
Yeah, so on the, on the first part of that, about encouraging corporates to not just sit on their offsets, but also to decarbonize as quickly as they can, as well as using offset services. I mean, that's really a key tenet of what we're recommending to our corporate partners, is that they do that. And we're very careful with the communications that we put out in collaboration with our partners to make sure that their offset program is not positioned as the solution at all, but it's positioned as one tool in the toolbox towards their overall climate strategy. And I think where corporates have been criticized in the past, it's often because of this overemphasis on offsetting as part of the carbon strategy of the company overall. So that positioning and acknowledging that offsetting is not the silver bullet solution, I think, is really strong in communications. And then in terms of advocating climate policy, which was the second part of that, that's mainly through ICROA, which I mentioned in the presentation. So ICROA stands for the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, and is this umbrella body which governs the voluntary carbon market. Members to ICROA have to be accepted and then are audited to make sure that they align with ICROA's best practice principles. And it's through ICROA that we drive for that best practice and make sure that best practice is adhered to. Is there anything you'd add to that, Rob?
No, I think that's that gives a good overview, Ollie. I think that the key thing is that carbon offsetting must always be used as one tool in a ambitious and science-based reduction policy. And secondly, yeah, there is a lot of there's a lot of work that's been done over the last 10 years to ensure quality and environmental integrity, and that includes ICROA. It also includes work with the third-party certification bodies, including, for example, the gold standard, which is one of the 3 or 4 most widely used certification bodies for the projects. And the gold standard is an NGO which is backed by WWF and about 50 other environmental organizations, and they're very focused on not just environmental integrity, but in delivering impacts against the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So it has to be seen in the round as a holistic project, which is delivering impact across many aspects. Next question. I'm trying to theme these questions, Ollie, but they're coming thick and fast, so you might be answering some of the same. Mike had a follow-up question from his earlier one about can his business, they've been working with ClimateCare for many years, and has asked whether it would be possible to select removal credits and projects specifically through ClimateCare. I can answer that one. Yeah. The answer, Mike, is yes. We're moving towards offering that as well as this kind of blended approach that Ollie's spoken about for large corporations. So be very happy to speak to you about that. Ollie, there are a few questions about nature-based solution projects and monitoring and verification and things. So I'll try and put those into one. Two are specifically about permanence. So Amrita asked, how do we ensure robust MRV for offsets based on nature-based solutions such as tree planting? What measures are in place to ensure permanence? And quite rightly mentions that trees only start sequestering carbon at scale once they've been growing for a while. Fintan asked about permanence as well, so you could give some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so generally, I mean, on the tree planting point, I think an important thing to recognize is that for the majority of projects, carbon credits are only issued once the sequestration has actually been monitored and verified and has actually been delivered. So I think we often see misinformed criticism of carbon offsetting, saying that it's based on tree planting and that the emission reduction may or may not happen in the future. But for the majority of projects, the system is designed so that the project only gets issued with the carbon credit once that sequestration has actually taken place, which is a key protection in the system, meaning that carbon credits are only issued once the result has actually been delivered that you're aiming for. The main way, I mean, so ClimateCare have a nature-based solutions specialist department, and so this is an area that we're highly specialized in, I'm sure. In fact, I think the next webinar we're doing is specifically on nature-based solutions, which could be an interesting one. The main way that permanence is accounted for is by the carbon standards, and the main standard which pertains to nature-based solutions is the voluntary carbon standard, the VCS. And permanence is obviously, closely guarded for in those standards and the methodologies that you have to follow in order to be accredited under those under the VCS. The main way that permanence is dealt with is through a risk buffer, which is applied on a per project basis. So when a project starts out, it has to apply a risk buffer tool that the standards have developed in order to account for all of the permanence risks that the project will face over its lifetime, which may be 100 years, let's say, for a tree planting project. And the risks are identified and they have to be mitigated. They also have to be quantified, and the project has to put credits that it receives into a risk buffer, which is managed by the VCS at the standard level. And there, if there are any reversals of the project, so if any of those risks come to fruition and there is a reversal, then credits in the global buffer pool, which VCS monitors, are taken out of circulation, such that the carbon credit that was initially issued still retains its environmental integrity. I'm sorry, because that's quite a technical, it's quite a technical area. Happy to follow up with more on the way that standards guard for permanence after the call.
Great, thanks, Ollie. Just this is from an anonymous attendee. Just clarifying that question is, just to be clear, abatement offsets can be used to reach carbon neutrality, but only removal offsets can help reach net zero. Is that correct? Is that the right interpretation?
Yeah, that sounds bang on to me. So to be carbon neutral, you have to balance your carbon footprint, and that can be with either avoidance or removals projects. But at the point you reach net zero, any footprint that remains from your company must be balanced by removals. And interesting, the Science-Based Target Initiative are currently working on a net zero standard, which will, I think, for some sectors, emissions should be reducible to zero. You might not need any removals because you'll be able to reduce your emissions entirely. And the Science-Based Target Initiative are working on a net zero standard, which will talk about that point of net zero and how much reduction you have to do versus removals to balance that. But yeah, the question was correct.
Yeah, I think it's worth just saying that there are lots of definitions of net zero around. It's quite a new concept and a new area, but it came initially from the IPCC and the UNFCCC around the world needing to be net zero by 2050, as Ollie mentioned, and that is with a focus on removing as much as is being put into the atmosphere on an annual basis, and therefore the emerging definitions of net zero from a corporate point of view, which are Science-Based Targets Initiative specifically, they speak in the same language as the IPCC in that the state of net zero, the destination of net zero, is to reduce your corporate footprint as much as possible in line with science, and then to be removing on an annual basis what is left of your footprint, so that there is no net increase in emissions, in atmospheric emissions. I think we're coming to the end of the session. I've got one more, Ollie, I think, here, which is developing removal nature-based solution projects requires upfront investment to launch them. For example, tree planting projects. Compared to the total cost of such a project over 10 and 20 years, what is the share that must be invested in the first 3 to 5 years? Difficult question to answer specifically, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think the question's right in that typically the capital required for projects like tree planting project is front weighted. Obviously, it varies a lot from project to project on what the financing availability is for that project, and therefore what capital is needed at which points. But broadly speaking, that's right. There's normally a front-loaded cost requirement for the project. Sorry, there was a second bit to the question, which
it was what kind of proportion needs to be upfront invested in the first 3 to 5 years over a 10 to 20 year timescale. I think it's difficult to say in percentage terms, because in our experience it changes from one project to another depending on the profile of that project. But the principle is right. A greater proportion of the finance is needed at the beginning, and it tails off over time. But we're working with a lot of our corporate clients on different financing structures to make sure that those projects can get off the ground and be properly managed and effective over a 10 to 20 year time frame. We've come to 2:45, Ollie. I think we've just about got through the questions, so I'm going to wrap up. Firstly, thanks again, everybody, for attending, and I hope it was useful. Firstly, and I hope that we've got through the questions satisfactorily. There are 2 or 3 questions which were a bit more technical and in a bit more detail that we'd love to follow up on specifically. So we'll endeavour to do that after the session. Before we go, Ollie did mention that our next webinar is going to be on nature-based solutions and nature-based projects. So you can find out more there. It's going to be on Tuesday, the 23rd of March, and we'll include a link to sign up for that in the follow-up email to everyone who is here today. So thank you again, everybody. Thanks for taking the time, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.